Hey everyone, welcome to I'm Aware That I'm Rare, the PH Aware podcast. I'm Steve Van Warmer from PH Aware Global Association. I'm here with Eric Borstein, a patient who you may recognize from the podcast who did an episode with us last year. Eric lives in Los Angeles. He was a pulmonary arterial hypertension patient diagnosed in 2020, and he's got some exciting updates to what has happened in his life since the last time he appeared on the show over a year ago. Eric, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Steve, and thank you for having me back.
Last year, you did a walk called Where is Evie? Basically, you walked from Santa Monica to San Diego over the course of a week. Before we get into that, I wanted to see if you could give viewers the overview of what happened to you back in 2020 that kind of led you to that first Where is Evie walk.
So September 21st, 2020, I collapsed in the bedroom and almost died. Was taken to St. John's Hospital here in Santa Monica, where I was stabilized and was diagnosed with class 4 pulmonary arterial hypertension. I had collapsed from severe right ventricular heart failure. After a few days and being stabilized, I was transported to Cedars-Sinai, and I spent a total of 16 days in the ICU and told my wife I had 3 to 6 months to live. And I didn't know any of this. I had made a decision very early on that I was going to beat this disease. And I didn't know what that meant, but I looked my wife straight in the eyes, tears rolling down my face, said, I'm going to beat this disease. And she had tears rolling down her face. And she said, I know you will. But I didn't know how sick I was. Came home and started walking, which helped mitigate those side effects. And, I tell people a block turned into 2, turned into 3, eventually a mile and 2 and 3. And walking just became a big part of my life. I also very early on started talking to a psychologist and realized that living with a terminal disease like PAH, positive mental health was very important. So through positive mental health, exercise, strict nutrition, and relying on family, friends, my neighbors, my community, what I call my village, I've made nothing short of a miraculous recovery. I was put on a pump. They never thought I would get off the pump. And after a year, my right ventricle made almost a complete recovery and I was taken off the pump. And I've been on oral medications ever since. Obviously, there's no cure for PAH, so I live with it. But I've adopted this, what I call pieces of my pie, which again are medicine, positive mental health, nutrition, exercise, and my village. And that's what I live by. Now that I'm better, I'm feeling better, I've dedicated my second part of my life, not only to my health and my family, but to advocacy and raising awareness for the disease, and then also for underprivileged people who need it most. When I was diagnosed with PAH, we have a family foundation and we got involved with National Jewish Health in Denver, and we got involved with funding research. This is a disease that nobody in my world had ever heard of before I was diagnosed. We looked around the country, found NGH. And so on one visit back there about probably 3 years ago now, I was introduced to Patty George, who was one of the founders of Team Phenomenal Hope. And they said, you've got to meet Patty. We met and her energy was infectious. The mission that the organization had aligned with the lifestyle I was living. Right around that time, my oldest daughter came to me and said, Dad, I want to do a fundraiser for a disease that you live with. And Where's Evie was born. What better organization to raise the money for than Team Phenomenal Hope? And so I thought, okay, let's do a walk. So we did a 5K walk and fundraiser. And I'm like, what better way to raise awareness for a rare disease than to go big? And I planned to walk from LA to San Diego, 170-mile walk. I would go down the coast, end in Del Mar. So we started planning Where's Evie, and what I thought would be 150 people coming out to a walk. Maybe we would raise $75,000 through friends and family and people that we know. And we raised close to $200,000, all for PAH research and helping provide for people living with the disease that need it most. The first Where's Evie, I walked from, like you said, Santa Monica. We headed down the coast. Once we hit Huntington Beach, I just went down pretty much Route 1. The biggest hurdle was Camp Pendleton. And it turns out through the help of Carl Hicks, another board member, but somebody who I've become very close with. It's a very close-knit community because the disease is so rare. And I've met so many amazing people along the way. Carl, who lost his daughter, Megan. Ashley Gambino, who I had the privilege to meet on a trip back to Las Vegas, who's a patient who has just an amazing story. And I met you and I learned about your story with Lucas. And it is just such a tight-knit community because when you're touched by this disease, whether it's losing a loved one or like myself being a patient, it's a family. So Carl helped us through Camp Pendleton. And that was a big hurdle because you can't go from LA to San Diego without going through Camp Pendleton. And the US Marines could not have been more supportive. That day, going through Camp Pendleton was the highlight of my week. I was being escorted by the Marines, and they brought in somebody to do an interview, and I'm interviewing and we're walking and I share my story, and he stops and he looks at me and he says, "Sir, can I ask you a question?" And he said, "Are you a Christian?" And I knew immediately why he was asking me this. And I said, "I'm not. But what I can tell you is I was given a second chance in life. And that second chance was to provide hope for those who need it most." He stops and I'm abbreviating the story, but he puts his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Sir, that's probably one of the most meaningful things I've ever heard in my life. And that transcends all religion. Thank you." And I realized right then and there that by sharing my story and by doing Where is Evie and raising awareness for the disease, you never know who you're going to help. And so we get through Pendleton and I'm with Hap Farber. He was accompanying me by bike down the coast, another board member, expert in the field, and has become a friend. We probably got into like the Del Mar area and I had already calculated, I'm feeling great. There's no way we're going 175 miles. And in Hap's head, he already had figured this out. He had already gotten to know me because I was pushing the whole way. I'm living with PAH. Here I am pushing, going down the coast. And we get into Old Town San Diego and we go to bed and we wake up and I turn to Hap and I'm like, "We're not going 180 miles. He goes, "I know. We're going 200. So we ended up going all the way down to Imperial Beach, if anybody knows Southern California, almost down to the border. We were like 3 miles from the border. Came and then went up through Coronado, ended in Del Mar. And it was 202 miles in 6.5 days, all raising awareness for PAH and PH. And so that was last September. The story just started to take off. I've met just some amazing people along the way, developed relationships with people along the way, and it's evolving. It's evolved into a movement is what I call it. I couldn't be luckier. People ask me, they say, "Do you have any regrets through this whole process?" I realized that, I put people through some hardship in those years leading up to collapsing. I knew I was sick, but I wasn't going to the doctor. I was afraid to find out what was wrong. And I learned later on from my psychologist that upwards of 75% of men who are very sick don't go to the doctor. So I wasn't alone, but I wasn't going to the doctor, and it was really creating hardship in my family and for my wife and my kids. And it was creating issues in the house. And through the whole process, I tell people, I'm like, I have 2 regrets. One is that I put my family through that in those 4 or 5 years, because living with PAH is very alienating. You can be surrounded by 20 people, but you're alone because you're suffocating. That was one of my regrets. And then my second regret is that one of my kids saw me collapse. And then my second daughter, it was during COVID, so everybody was home. And my second daughter came up and so sees me, lying in a pool of blood. And that is the hardest thing for me. And that is my biggest regret. But besides that, I tell people, if it didn't happen so dramatically with stress that was going on in my life, I might have been still dealing with that, but maybe I solved my health issues, but not everything would have been resolved. And when I collapsed, I tell people it was like breaking through a sheet of ice. Everything went away. All problems, all stress, anything I was dealing with, I decided right there and then I was going to get help. I wasn't going to die. And I headed down a completely different path and I haven't looked back. That's my only regret. The last year has just taken on this amazing life of its own. And I look at this as a second chance. So through speaking engagements and then this very special project that we're now working on, I was approached about doing a full feature documentary and hired an amazing production company who's both familiar with, obviously very good at documentaries, but also familiar in the rare disease field. It's owned by a woman by the name of Christy McCaffrey. Amazing person, mom. She lost her mom to scleroderma, so she understands rare diseases. And we're working on this amazing film. It's going to educate people on PH and it's going to educate people on PAH, but it's really a movie about overcoming adversity and providing hope. And through the adversity, what people do. And it's going to feature myself and my story, but it's bringing in Carl Hicks, and he's going to share his story. It's going to bring in yours truly, and it's going to bring in Ashley Gambino, and it's going to share their stories, but it's going to share what each individual has done through their adversity, through their moment and what they've done with it. And the hope is that, it educates people on the importance of mental health and village and education and exercise and diet. But really, for anybody going through adversity, whether it's living with a rare disease, losing a home in a fire, going through a divorce, losing a loved one, being diagnosed with anything, taking that first step and utilizing these tools and, how have we gotten through it and what are we doing with it? And, we've all decided to take that first step in our own way. And my hope is by sharing my story and sharing these other stories that other people can see that and they can see if we can do it, they can do it. So that's a really special project that I'm working on. And then we're putting together the second annual Where is EB? And, that's going to be on September 7th. And after the event, after the 5K, which is going to be an amazing, fun morning with food and giveaways and music and speakers, everybody's going to bid me adieu. And I'm going to head down the coast again and walk 200 miles in 6.5 days from LA to San Diego. And we're going to do it all over again, all with the hopes of raising as much awareness for the rare disease that I live with, which is pulmonary arterial hypertension and pulmonary hypertension.
It's interesting when you describe what happened to you 5 years ago, when you decide to pick yourself up and to move forward, whether you be the patient in your case or a care partner or whatever it is, a spouse of someone afflicted by this disease. Can you tell me a little bit about how in your brain you kind of go from this selfish to selfless role, if that's an accurate portrayal? I feel that for myself, and it's just like how you are pulling at threads in the community and relationships and people and being blessed with having access to doctors and other patients and support and all that. How do you reconcile that in yourself, just in your daily life or when you're singularly walking the streets or the highways of Los Angeles halfway to San Diego?
Helping others came naturally to me. I have a philanthropic background. It was instilled in my brothers and I very early on that, we're fortunate. And because we're fortunate, we should give back. We have to. It really wasn't a choice. We're going to give back. I've always volunteer coached. Even before I had kids, I volunteered places. So I always gave my time, even before I had the means to give and help others financially. And I've also been a very outgoing person. We always had people over at our homes. I always wanted to be around friends. I was just a very upbeat, outgoing, friendly person, giving person. And so in those, I'll call it the 4 years, 5 years leading up to collapsing and pulling away, other than suffering health-wise and it getting worse and then to the point where I couldn't walk and breathe. The hardest thing was pulling back, and it sent me into depression. I was depressed. I didn't see it. My wife saw it, but I was depressed. Now looking back, it's because it wasn't me. That was a really difficult time. And I'm the least selfish person you'll meet naturally. I give. I don't like to take, I give. And so I didn't understand it going through it. But one of the reasons why I was becoming depressed was because I wasn't myself. I wasn't happy. I wasn't wanting to be with people. I was really pulling back. After I collapsed and I was stabilized and I was able to start to kind of look out for others again, it was just so easy and natural to want to help others. And, sharing my story was very therapeutic, and to this day is very therapeutic for myself. It helps me. It is a reminder of where I've come in such a short period of time when I'm able to tell people I just walked 30 miles today. Because living with a disease is very difficult. People look at me and they're like, you look great, but it's a grind. It is a grind living with PAH. It's every day you got to deal with really bad side effects. Again, one of the main reasons why I walk. You deal with the fact that you're going to live with this disease for the rest of your life, as long as you're alive. In the back of your mind, it's always there. Are my lungs going to fail? Is my heart going to fail? It's always there. So it is a battle. It is a daily battle, both mentally and physically. But when I was able and I was healthy enough to help others, it was just very natural. And so it's something that's just in me. It's something that is very important to me. And so when I realized that my story was touching people both inside and outside of the PAH and PH world, it's something that I feel is my responsibility. I am very fortunate that I'm able to dedicate my life to my health. I'm very fortunate that I have an amazing business partner that takes on most of the day-to-day operations of our business. I'm fortunate that I've got the best doctors and I've got great insurance and I can afford the co-pays and I can have a psychologist. I am very aware of that. But I'm also very aware that most people aren't so fortunate, especially in the rare disease world. There's just not a lot of attention and dollars at the national level spent on these diseases, and the underserved are underserved. So I feel like it's my duty to help those. It's my duty to provide, toward research to hopefully find new therapies and extend lives. And so I've rededicated the second part of my life, not only to myself and to be as healthy as I can, and to my wife and kids and those around me, but to help those others that need it most and to raise as much awareness for this disease as I can while I'm here.
For me, I feel I was always very lucky. We were always very lucky, my wife and I, with our son, Lucas. He was diagnosed relatively early. We had great access to insurance. We had good doctors. And so when you find people, when you know there's people in the community that don't have that access to services, or they can't afford a clinic, or they're just lost in the wayside, right? And so I think that finding people like yourself, like Carl Hicks, another great friend I've known 2 decades, that especially ones that have lost somebody, I feel like it would be easy to kind of just let the next generation figure it out. But I think this disease in particular is really built on the backs of all the families and community and the doctors that came before it. You mentioned this other patient, Ashley Gambino. She's someone that's going to be a speaker at a December conference that's being held in Boston. So the listeners have not heard her story yet, but they will. But as another powerful story of a patient who went through a lot of tragedy and is really picked herself up and is really working to help herself first and foremost, and helping many others beyond that.
One of the things that I have found being a patient, another highlight of my year this past year was I was invited to go to Washington on World PH Day and meet with congressional delegates and meet with U.S. senators and their offices and staff and share my story and advocate for hopefully no cuts to NIH funding, Medicaid, and the like. And with everything going on, I felt, again, it was so important to do that. And it was a highlight of my year. And what I'm finding, in moments like that, I was elected board chair of Team Phenomenal Hope this year. And being an advocate for the disease and through Wear a ZB, what I'm finding is because I'm a patient and I'm living with this disease almost took my life. It's a different perspective, but it's a very effective perspective. It's something that I don't take lightly. Again, yourself included, Carl, amazing advocates and voices for the disease. Ashley, she struggles. She's much more newly diagnosed, and she'll share that in her story, but we're in different stages. But because I am able to, I feel it's important and it's effective being a patient. My livelihood depends on these things. My livelihood could depend on the next therapy, and those therapies come from NIH funding and they all start somewhere. And so being that patient voice is something I don't take lightly, and it's something that I'm really embracing. Again, I've always been passionate about philanthropy, and I sit on other boards, and all of them are so important. But living with this disease and advocating for this disease is something that I've never felt so passionately about.
That's wonderful. We are blessed to have you. I think we would be remiss if we didn't say, and I trust you would agree, that a patient specifically who might be listening to this, while neither of us are doctors, the importance of pulmonary rehab and all that is a good thing. But I think we should tell patients, if you're inspired by a person like yourself, Eric, they should definitely talk to their healthcare team before embarking out on doing walks and all that stuff. Mental health, on the other hand, I would say that's a pretty large part of your pie. Would you agree?
It is. I tell people I wouldn't be alive without the medications, obviously. I'm extremely lucky that my body reacted so quickly to the medication that I was on. That's number one. Then after that, I listen to my doctors religiously. I listen to my body religiously. If something is not right, I call my doctor immediately. I'll never make those mistakes again. But yes, positive mental health is as important as the medications. People ask me, why do you walk? I say positive mental health. What I've learned is positive mental health, and I've learned this from my psychologist, who's an amazing man. Positive mental health really equates to finding something that you love to do. For me, that's been walking. For somebody else, that could be learning how to play classic guitar. For somebody else, that could be swimming. For somebody else, that could be playing chess. It's finding something that you love to do in the face of dealing with adversity and everything else. So again, I was lucky enough in the hospital to have a nurse and nurses that kind of pushed me into it because they saw me feeling so bad. And I was lucky enough that my body allowed me to start walking. Other people, it could be something else. I just tell people living with PAH, find something that you love to do that will provide positive mental health, because I've learned is equally as important in this journey as everything else. The other thing that I will say is extremely important is knowing that you're not alone. One of the things that I learned, and I knew, you almost take it for granted, but that I've learned now is you're not alone. Whether you've got an amazing wife and kids like I do, or friends or family or neighbors or a support group, whether it's one person or 100 people, to share what you're going through with and to have there with you if you have to go to the doctor and you want somebody to help be your voice or whatever it may be. Know that you're not alone. I could have been surrounded by 20 people and I would have been alone when I was struggling. But now, when I have a bad day, I call friends and I've learned that they care. Family cares. My doctors care. So I love talking to support groups. I love talking to nurses and first responders, and people care and they want to hear your story. They want to talk to you, and it's hard enough living with PAH. Don't do it alone.
Having talked to so many people just in person through this podcast, whatnot, is there so many people that have filled that void or have done things. In my son's case, he was really into art. In another person's case, they wanted to be a violinist or a singer. They focus on what they can do and not what they are told they can't or shouldn't or whatever, right? But nonetheless, you really hit it with doing what you love, positive mental focus, a great care team. All those components are very important. I'm so glad you're part of this community and open yourself to others and to sharing your story. Here we are here again, this next EB walk in September, Sunday, September 7th. I believe the race starts at 9 a.m. Registration opens at 8. But tell us what we're going to expect there.
The second annual Where's EB 5K will be at the Annenberg Community Beach House in Santa Monica, September 7th. Registration opens at 8 a.m. The walk starts around 9 a.m. It'll be co-hosted by Lisa Fox and 104.3 My FM. They'll have their street team out there. We're going to have breakfasts provided, giveaways. It's a really fun morning. We had an amazing time last year. And then we all go and walk together. We go down to the Santa Monica Pier and back, and then we all group back together, and there's music and some speakers. Myself, I'll share my story. We have some other people that get up and speak. It's an amazing, inspiring morning for people coming around and supporting this disease. It's free to register. Everything is provided. You get a nice t-shirt. And again, we're going to have other giveaways, raffles. You go to whereiseb.org. You can follow on Instagram at where_is_EB. We welcome anybody and everybody to come out. Again, it's an amazing morning. And then probably around 11:30, everybody kind of cheers me on and I head down the coast and I go off on my walk. And then again, online and through our Instagram, you can follow me with updates all the way down the coast. This year, we have an amazing auction, silent auction that's attached to the event. So you can go online again to whereiseb.org and check out that auction. We've got some amazing items this year, Dodgers, Lakers, Bruins tickets, concert tickets, vacations. It's all to support Team Phenomenal Hope and providing hope and support for patients living with pulmonary hypertension that need it most. I hope everybody comes out, walks, and again, go to whereiseb.org and you can follow us on where_is_EB.
Well, I will be there. Many of us will be there. Thank you so much, Eric, for being here. Really appreciate it. And we wish you much success with that.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you for having me back on in this opportunity. My name is Eric Borstein, and I'm aware that I'm rare.